Without further ado, we're transitioning now to our forest sector wildfire panel. And just a little background, we held this time to talk about current issues. And as we were heading towards the end of the summer, current issues, we're looking, I was kind of combing through what kind of current issues are we going to talk about here. And then we had the event on Labor Day, and really the current issue was no longer a question. We have very much a current issue that is affecting all of us and has affected all of Oregon, frankly, with a number of evacuees, poor air quality, people on alert, as well as all of the landowners, foresters, agency personnel, whether you were impacted by the fires on your property personally, or whether you were dispatched or just breathing it, it was all around us. And so I really appreciate this panel coming together on the heels of very short notice and a lot of hard work, frankly, over the last several weeks, trying to get a handle on the fire suppression effort. And so we've got with us today Doug Grafe, Chief of Fire Protection with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Doug began his career with ODF in 2003 as a stewardship forester and then a unit forester in the Toledo unit in West Oregon District. He joined the Protection Division in 2009 and served in various leadership positions, becoming the Chief of Fire Protection in 2015. And this is one I didn't know, but Doug, despite his accent that maybe would lead you to think he was from a little bit, would go to school a little bit further north, he actually has his bachelor's degree in forestry from University of Florida. So we have a Gator in our midst. He has served as a professional forester for over 20 years with a variety of organizations, including private, city, and consulting, as well as the state, and the Forest Service. So he's kind of been all around there. Throughout his career, Doug has remained a member of the professional organization, the Society of American Foresters, our professional organization, and is fostering a vision of sustainable forest management, including wildfire protection. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Doug Grafe, and joining this panel is going to be Doug Grafe, and I'll just go ahead and introduce them all now. Rick Barnes is also joining this panel. Rick Barnes founded Barnes & Associates. Many of you know Rick through the years in Oregon. He's been a very prominent forester and a name in Oregon, and served in a lot of various roles with the Small Woodlands Association and Tree Farm, as well as several others. He owns and operates Barnes & Associates. They manage over 80,000 acres on an ongoing basis, as well as numerous small woodland properties across the state. They work in both preparing forest management plans, timber cruising and appraising, marketing forest products, as well as other various projects. Rick is also a strong member of the and I want to make sure I get this correctly, which association, but the Forest Protection Association. I don't see it here, Rick, which one you're a member. Isn't it it's the COOS, isn't it? Oh, you're on mute, but that's all right.
Douglas.
Douglas, there you go. That's what I meant. Douglas. Okay. So he'll talk about some of that, of course, relating to the topic at hand here today. He's got a degree, a bachelor's degree in forest management from OSU, and a master's degree in business administration from Southern Oregon State College. And then last but certainly not least, we've got Kyle Williams joining us on this panel. Kyle's the Director of Forest Protection at the Oregon Forest Industries Council. He brings more than 16 years of fire protection experience on both private and public forest lands in Oregon. Kyle's got a bachelor's degree in geography from Western Oregon University. And prior to joining OFIC, Kyle worked in private industry, and most recently as a harvest manager and previously as environmental affairs manager for Plum Creek and Weyerhaeuser Company. So he's got nearly 13 years of experience in various positions at ODF as well, also kind of crossing paths there, or some shared history there with Doug, as both of them served in the Toledo unit out on the coast. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over first to Doug to kind of set the stage for this conversation.
Okay, Seth, thank you all for the invite. Glad to be here and join with my friends here on this panel. I'll kick it off with a little bit about the organization, Department of Forestry's role in fire protection. We'll talk about, obviously, the Labor Day events, September 7th, moving forward, where we're at today. We'll touch on some basic stats, but it really tells the stories, numbers, fires, acres burned, and then really close with some perspective relative to what that means in our history. And I will share a screen to walk through a presentation here with you to facilitate that effort. All right, interesting to me, folks, is I gave a presentation here in 2013 after the epic fire season that we had, and I think I described that, as I reviewed my notes from that time, as once in a career event. And here we are once again, and here we've been, frankly, since 2013, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. But let's first start and speak to ODF's role in fire protection. First, I draw attention to, we protect about 16 million acres across 12 protection districts across the state. So forest and grazing lands, you'll see that in the brown and the yellow across those protection districts, and the blue lines there all the way from Northwest Oregon down to Southwest Oregon. The brown is the BLM lands, and you'll all recognize that as the ONC lands. Oregon, California lands, about 2.2 million acres of BLM land. There's about another 1.8 million of public lands in Northwest there. You see the state forests that we also protect. And the remaining 12 million acres is private lands across the state. You'll notice in Southeast Oregon, in the brown and yellow, that's out in the range country. We also coordinate closely with those volunteer organizations, the Rangeland Fire Protective Associations. In the green, within our protection districts, we're joined with the Forest Service. The darker green brings out the wilderness areas. So obviously they have their protection responsibilities. And then in the purple, Warm Springs Reservation protects their lands. Many of the other tribes are integrated within other protection systems. So we protect tribal lands across those 12 protection districts. So all in all, the jurisdiction and responsibility of the Department of Forestry is about 16 million acres of forest and grazing land, a long history, 109 years of evolution that's put us today on the map. And it's, as you look at this map with all the colors, I think it's important to identify those colors and note it takes a complete and coordinated fire protection system to get there. So all those partners play in fire protection. What's very unique, and I think separates Oregon from the rest of the nation, is the right, role, and responsibility of private landowners to provide for fire protection on their lands. And you'll hear from that specifically from the rest of the panel. So what set us up for the Labor Day fires for 2020 fire season? The underlying drought conditions was certainly a main theme, and you can see extreme drought still on September 29th, much of the state and most of the state in some type of abnormally dry up into extreme drought conditions. That's even after the rains. So what that should tell you is on September 7th, we were in a different position, even more extreme. And we added this weather event on top of those dry conditions. And relative to those dry conditions, as we look at 30 years of history of tracking fire indices, we were at record highs rolling into this event. This is September 7th. We have a dry cold front moving from the northeast on the screen across the state. And I'll draw your attention to a couple items there. This is the beginning of September 7th. The cold front's moving through. First, I would draw your attention to the Lion's Head and Beachy fires. Right when that cold front hits the center of Oregon, you can see those really start to move. The Beachy's really overwhelmed by Lion's Head, which is burning now, and those smoke is moving to the south. Right at this point, you see those fires really pick up, you know, late afternoon when that cold front hits. The other place I would draw your attention to is behind the cold front where those clouds are coming in. You really see the sky open up and you can see what happens to Washington. So if you watch again in Northeast Washington, they had a fire, Cold Springs fire, that you can see the smoke kicking. They had a north wind on it at that time. That ran 50 miles that day in one day by the end of the day, to give perspective. The dry cold front was followed by 72 hours of east winds. So these are the infamous Santa Ana winds. It's the same thing we get up here in Oregon and Washington. Sustained winds 20 to 30 miles an hour with gusts up to 50 to 60 in the mountain passes and down the drainages, the canyons where we experienced some major fires. I think the final point I'd draw attention to on this day as it cycles through is look at California. That continues today. I flew the fires just a couple days ago, and when we got to the California border, you couldn't really see the ground from 10,000 feet elevation, and simply just turned around. Didn't get a really good look at the slate of fire. Saw the Oregon side, but California continues to burn, and you can see the activity here on the 7th. So really a regional event. Those three weather phenomena aligned, you know, the dry fuel conditions, this dry cold front, and then the east winds really to catastrophic effect. And this is where we're at today on the landscape. This briefing map highlights the 17 fires that were active since the 7th. Just in these fires alone, close to 1 million acres burned from that weather event and the dry fuel conditions. Over 4,500 structures lost, the majority of those being primary residents. This ODF gross cost is a projection. The next slide down the road here a little bit will highlight we sit currently at $125 million in cost. I expect it to be above 130 when this is all done. The large fires that most folks are hearing about and tracking, Riverside, Beachy, Lion's Head. I find it fascinating from the east crest of the Cascade, where Lion's Head starts out of Warm Springs, all the way across to Lyons. That's 56 miles long, a contiguous fire down the Santiam Canyon. We haven't seen the likes of these types of events in some time, and I'll give you some historic perspective as we close. What's also compelling about those three fires, not only did Lion's Head, Beachy grow together, as you look at the west side that was pushing to the valley bottom, that's 36 miles north and south of fire front, moving towards the valley bottom. So dramatic and powerful fire behavior over a 72-hour period. And our mission was clearly life safety. Holiday Farm, Archie Creek, frankly amazing to me that we're sitting where we are today with these fires, talking about turning them back to the local districts. And you'll hear from my panelists, fellow panelists, you know, in large part, the available resources that we have in Oregon relative to that responsibility of landowners to participate in the fire protection system is what makes us special and what makes us have the ability to wrap 300 plus miles of containment lines around a Holiday Farm and Archie Creek fire and using those local resources. Moving south to South Obenchain, Alameda, out of Medford, Ashland, dramatic fires. Flying over Alameda fire a couple days ago was humbling. We had DC-10s, so the very large air tankers, round robin flying, in town, in communities, putting retardant lines where we're typically used to putting them on ridge tops. We're putting them down and on top of homes across neighborhoods. And that's what kept that Alameda fire in that narrow window that you see. Looks like a cigar shape heading from southeast to northwest. Multiple other fires. I think I'll stop here. I think folks have been tracking pretty closely with this whole event, obviously with the smoke impacts, etc. But we've listed all the fires from Pike Road, where we evacuated Bay City, up north out of Tillamook, Echo Mountain, where we lost 290 homes outside of Lincoln City. These numbers are staggering and something we haven't experienced. Chehalem Mountain, flying scoopers, north of Newburgh, within that wildland urban interface, have an ODF deploy military aircraft out of Hillsborough to protect power line fires and Chehalem fires, keeping those in check, and to support North Cascade Complex east of Portland. Are things that I never thought we'd be in a place of mobilizing assets. What this means to ODF statistics is staggering. We protect, as I highlighted, 12 million acres of private lands, and a significant portion of those have burned in a way that we have not seen in our history of 109 years. Our 10-year average is 41,000 acres burned. We're sitting at over 550,000. The next slide draws the attention to the cost since 2013, when I first presented to my peers here with SAF. We didn't see this coming relative to moving that dial to $70 million on an annual basis, when we're used to just below $10 million of large fire suppression costs on ODF protected lands, those 16 million acres that we protect. It's staggering to think about what we have experienced since 2013. The acres are also consistent with that. Again, the 125 is a projection from October 7th. Sorry, is a static from October 7th. Obviously, that will pick up in time, and I think will be well over $130 million, increasing that average since 2013 on costs. And then the acres burned, there's really no comparison. And I'll close with a historical perspective on what this looks like. But by looking at the past 3 decades, 11,000 acres burned is what we typically experience in the 90s, moving to 26,000 acres burned with some significant activity in 2002 to a pretty consistent higher level, but really unprecedented at 551,000, off the charts. And it really will confuse and skew our acres burned. I'm hoping that we don't see this again to this effect. And I wanted to close with historical perspective. This is really a busy chat, and it's worth spending more time. I know you all, as professional foresters in the discipline of fire protection that's within our purview, would be interested in this, but I really wanted to just highlight compelling story around our history, which is the bar chart. The orange is drought years, and back in the beginnings of, before World War II, had a lot of fire on the landscape. Our greatest acres burned on ODF protected lands, 1933, with the first Tillamook burns at 340,000 acres. We've obviously surpassed that by over 200,000 acres on ODF protected lands. This chart shows the trend line of numbers of fires and trend line on lightning, and human caused in blue, and lightning. So there's a lot of depth here, but what's compelling is from 13 forward, we see this trend changing. And how do we adapt fire protection and forest management in this changing world? That's very clear, and particularly with this event this year, well over 550,000 acres off the map. And one of the key drivers as we study our indices on what our risk is at the table, as we look back to 1995 forward, one of the key elements is energy release components. Gives us an indication of the volatility of fire on any given day, and we're certainly seeing an increase in our risk on year to year. That trend line is pretty clear, where we're in the range of less than 20 days of high risk, and we're well up into the 60 days, given this energy release component. And we'll continue to track this. Bottom line, more complex without a doubt of fire protection. And with that, I'll close for my other panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. And I think we'll go ahead. We'll keep rolling your questions forward, folks that have questions, and we'll hold the questions to the end and ask the questions of the panel. But I did want to one of the comments that came in the Q&A was just a recognition of the very stressful time that this has been, especially for you and your shop and folks within the department. And want to thank you for your leadership and all the work you guys have done. So I think that's a pretty across the board sentiment. So I wanted to express that before we move to our next panelist. And I think that goes equally for our next panelists as well, and the many landowners that were out there joining forces with our agency partners to suppress the fires. And so we're pleased to have Rick Barnes join us here, and Rick spent his time both with his folks and some of his equipment, and he personally spent time out there on the fires in Douglas County. And so perspective of this event from Rick.
Okay, great. Thank you, Seth. Okay, you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, so my presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on the Archie fire and talk about kind of the experiences that we had with that. The Archie fire started just after midnight on the 8th, and things happened very quickly. This is a picture taken from the home of Ben and Alicia Christensen, fellow SAF members, from their home at 11:32 a.m. on the 8th. And the next picture was taken 40 minutes later. You can see that you can just imagine, put yourself in their shoes and what they were experiencing and feeling. And you notice the back of their car is up, they're loading, and they were evacuated for a number of days. In total on the Archie fire, there's 109 homes lost. Fortunately, Christensen's was not one of them. The immediate intensity was just nothing like we've seen in Douglas County. We had two active operations, and one of our operators called. I'd called them early in the morning and warned them about a fire, but it was 3.5 miles away. But I just suggested they keep heads up. Well, a little later, they called me and said they were trying to get lowboys up there, but Oregon State Police had the highway closed, and was asking if I could get permission for them to get their lowboys up there to get equipment out. And the DFPA airplane was in the air. And so they took a look at the area, and the response back from them after they looked at it from the air was, no, you cannot get your lowboy up there, and get out of the area as soon as possible. In total, there were 6 logging sites or portions thereof lost in the fire. The next few slides just show kind of what it looked like that first day, and the intensity, and just as we were trying to figure out where do you start in wrapping your arms around this beast was not an easy answer to the problem. Put it a little bit in perspective, the Archie fire, as Doug mentioned, he showed a similar map. At the end of September, the Archie fire was 130,000 acres, which was way beyond anything that I'd experienced in my career. But at the same time, we had 4 fires in Oregon, Western Oregon, larger than the Archie fire. So as we were competing for resources, we knew that they were going to be very hard to come by because we had residences and communities at risk, but those other fires had the same issues. The overhead was another thing that was really short supply, non-existent, so we had to rely on industry and landowners for that overhead. The lands, the BLM lands, the private lands, there was some state of Oregon lands, county lands, all were protected by the Douglas Forest Protected Boat Association. Currently, I'm president of the association. Not very proud that this happened on my watch, but I don't know what we could have done about it. We realized very early on that landowners were just going to have to really step to the plate, and operators to get our arms around this. Initially, the first couple of days, the priority was to protect the residences, the communities that were being threatened by the fire. One of the things that helped us was DFPA has pre-season agreements with a lot of the landowners and operators in the area. And they also train fire personnel, the logging crews, and some of the landowner staff. They trained over 500 employees, and our landowners have made huge commitments to have some of their staff, predominantly foresters, trained for overhead positions, predominantly local resource boss and task force leaders. And so they were trained, and they had 80 pre-season agreements in place. Those pre-season agreements not only address equipment rates, but also talk about what's the training. You have to show proof that the employees have had both basic fire behavior training as well as fire shelter training, and then supplying proof of insurance and listing the state as additional insured. So it's a big project, big process, but important process that's done pre-season. And then 40 agreements were added during the fire as well. Landowners and operators played a huge role. Local resource bosses and task force leaders, just in the 3 major landowners, Seneca Jones, Lone Rock Timber, Roseburg Resources, and then we contributed Barnes and Associates, relative to them, a small piece, but we had 47 overhead, over 111 employees, both equipment operators and foresters, and many of them foresters involved on the fire, 92 different pieces of contractor equipment. And this does not include the many small woodland owners that were involved as well in protecting their own lands or neighbors' lands. And then one of the things that we had that was very helpful was our landowners have very good GIS systems, and it was we were utilizing that GIS asset. We would download the infrared information from the infrared flights, so we were getting every other night, and putting those over our landowner maps and looking at contour maps, and in some cases LiDAR based maps to help us in making decisions in the morning as far as how to best utilize our time during the day. And then also it helps to highlight where the real lookout situations are and the risks that we have to be alert and heads up on. Here's just a few pictures building a fire trail. One of the things that we recognized, or just a reality, was there were no hand crews available. So we were, in this picture shows a tethered logging equipment, and we used that to build hand line where historically we've done it by hand. but it was, very useful, and it actually worked quite successfully, and pretty creative solution to get some handrail built. More handrail, and in total, and I think these numbers are grossly conservative, but on private land, 60 miles of dozer line and 7.5 miles of hand line. And then if you look at the fire as a whole, they're looking at 87 miles of dozer line and 14 miles of hand line. And this doesn't include the roads that were improved or work done on to make them available to use as fire line as well. One of the things, if you look at the site today, is there's not a mosaic in a lot of the area where it's green in the riparian areas, and some places that kind of escape the fire. There are just huge areas where it's hard to find a green tree. It just was extremely hot and very destructive as it went through. Certainly you get on the perimeter of the fire, there's some spotty areas and in a few areas, but there's vast areas that look like this. So now, we worked our tails off doing everything we could to get line in place. And so what do the landowners and we doing for our clients at this time? The first thing after we finished with the fire suppression activities, we started opening roads so we could get in and assess what does the resource look like. We recognize a tremendous need to replace culverts. A lot of us have put in plastic culverts and were burnt. So that's a huge project that's undergoing to get those. And, we're hustling to get that done. As we know, the wet weather's coming at us. So lots of activity out there on private landowners' lands, working on that, starting to lay out units and identifying, are there any areas that we can avoid salvage logging? That's something we certainly want to do if we can, because we don't want to push any more volume out into the marketplace than we absolutely have to, because of the tremendous surge that's going to be necessary to get the salvage done throughout the state. We've personally negotiated some timber sales and working on negotiating more timber sales to get those out in the door. Revising budgets. I mean, it's certainly turned budgets upside down, and landowners are needing to know what's the impacts to the budget, their cash flow, et cetera. So we're trying to get them the best information we can as timely as we can, and revising our plans for those management units. We recognize tremendous reforestation needs, so we're out obtaining seed, talking to nurseries to come up with arrangements for growing seedlings and making plans. One of the concerns we have is where are we going to come up with the tree planters to plant as many seedlings as need to be planted, assuming we can get them grown. So that's one of the many constraints that we're working through and thinking about. And as we move forward, it's just salvage, and then the reforestation that follows it. There's already a lot of salvage has begun. Logs are being delivered to mills. In fact, I know some mills started receiving logs a week ago, last Monday. So salvage has begun. This is a picture of a private landowner that's salvaging their timber and getting right after it. Unfortunately, this person not only lost a substantial amount of their timber, but also lost 9 pieces of logging equipment. Other things that we recognize as times of the essence. I mean, we just got to do everything we can to get stuff out as quick as we can. We're worried about the deterioration just due to checking and then the insects. So there's nothing we can really do to protect that other than just move as quickly as we can. And issues we're dealing with, loggers are extremely short supply. Not only did we lose a number of them, or they lost a number of pieces of logging equipment, but we've also seen just a tremendous uptick in volume that's going to need to be moved. So it's really difficult to come up with operators. And moving forward, mills are only going to be able to take so much. So we're really concerned about that capacity. But I know they'll do everything they can to absorb that raw material. And we recognize we have a long road ahead of us. And then, this last slide, man, we're looking forward to a vacation. Unfortunately, it's going to be some time before we're going to be able to do that. But, this slide is one of the expenses I pay for having my wife edit and prepare the PowerPoint presentation. She doesn't seem to mind the fact that I catch twice as many fish as she does. Anyway, thank you, and open to questions. Thanks, Seth.
That's a great slide to end on there, Rick. We looking forward to a vacation. I think that could be the theme for 2020 for many of us. So appreciate this. Again, Rick's going to stay on the panel. We've got several questions coming in, both for Rick and Doug so far. So we're going to hold those and go straight into Kyle Williams, and we'll get to questions here shortly. So keep those rolling in, folks. Kyle, I know you spent in your role at OFIC, you play a tremendous role in trying to coordinate from Salem some of the effort of the protection associations, and trying to fill in gaps where you can and help communication lines and all of that. So as all of this was happening, I know you were tremendously busy as well. So Kyle, thanks for joining us and giving us your perspective.
Yeah, appreciate it, Seth. Again, Kyle Williams, Director of Forest Protection at OFIC. And as you can imagine, kind of the way Rick mentioned, being president when something like this goes down, when you're the Director of Forest Protection with the month we've had, I'm not really expecting a positive performance appraisal coming up here this winter. It didn't turn out well, but really want to say thanks for inviting me. Seth mentioned geography degree. Appreciate this professional world adopting me as one of your own and letting me be part of this community. I just wanted to get that out of the way first. So when somebody puts the ball on a tee, as well as Doug and Rick have done, your job is to just, hit the chip shot and get out of the way. So let me catch us up here. As we move forward, like Rick said and Doug mentioned, the landowner component of the system in Oregon is hugely critical to the success as a state. And I couldn't have put it any better than Joe Justice did earlier, relative to that partnership between private landowners and operators and the state of Oregon, ODF specifically, in how we fight fire. And the Labor Day event was a perfect example of what we talk about, of that complete and coordinated system in action. Industry resources, all of those fires on Doug's map, industry resources were engaged in every single one of those and some additional. There were smaller fires that never hit the headlines because there were folks from industry and operators that jumped out there while ODF was overwhelmed with other initial attacks and helped. And then you see right at the end of the list there, arson patrol. There were members of the timber industry that were out keeping additional fires off the landscape when ODF and federal resources were completely overwhelmed at the time. And so it despite the tragedy of the moment, it really was a shining example of what the landowners and operators bring to bear. And that's you guys as foresters in this state. Some specific examples of that, Rick had mentioned the substantial effort just on Archie Creek. If you look statewide, we had over 350 pieces of equipment from the timber industry that responded to these fires. And let me be specific about this. These are pieces of equipment that were signed up on those incident resource agreements that Rick mentioned, or part of an incident action plan, formally on the fire. So there were many, many, many more that were just taking part in suppression activity that, went home at the end of the day or the end of the fire and didn't expect to formally get paid for it. And so this is just a portion of the resources. And when you look at those specific resources, things like the shovels and lowboys and bunchers, if you are relying just on the federal system, you know, when they talk firefighting resources, you're thinking hand crews, engines, tenders, that kind of thing. Those are, you know, somewhat readily available. But when you start getting into those more specific pieces of heavy equipment and need to order those up through the federal system, you're waiting 3-4 days for something to come on an agreement from Montana, you know, Southeast, you name it. These resources were available immediately in that first operational shift that they could actually engage the fires. And that is enormous in terms of success. And like Rick and Doug both mentioned, in many cases, these resources were the only ones on vast portions of these fires. And then you get into our personnel. Again, you've seen some examples from the specific fires, but when I tallied it up from the statewide perspective, again, just the ones we can track, over 650 industry personnel were engaged in these fires. And that's not an accident, right? Our industry personnel, like Rick mentioned, we train preseason. We work with ODF preseason to get organized and set up to be able to respond. All of the companies do this on their own dime, not expecting to be reimbursed unless something happens. And so that's a huge testament to our portion of that partnership that Joe mentioned earlier. And then it's estimated just in those 650 people, there was over 78,000 hours of industry personnel time on the incidents. And again, just a tip of the iceberg as we talk about the full effort. So then the other interesting thing about these fires and the way they burned, and Doug mentioned it, the event that we had, you probably could have burned a glacier in that first 36 hours, 48 hours. And what's interesting is the acres that we burned roughly match the ownership pattern for timberland in Oregon, and that's 40% private, 60% federal, and that's about what's going to come out of these total acres burned. I show you this picture of the progression map on Holiday Farm for a reason. Typically, when you look at a progression map, each one of the colors represents an individual day, and we've talked about the examples of how intense this event was. Holiday Farm, as one example, these colors out until you get to the dark green line are hourly increments, right? And you can look over there on the left how fast that went, but the green line is just 1 day of movement on that fire. In that first, what we typically refer to in the fire service as an operational shift, that thing put on 200 miles of exterior line. And so when you start wrapping your head around that being one of 17 fires in that couple day period, it's amazing what we were able to accomplish. And that's again is a testament to the only way it works is the partnership between the state and private resources, private landowner and operator resources. So just that progression map, hopefully we won't ever see that again in our lifetime. I'm not saying it won't, but that's impressive. So then breaking down a little bit more specifically on we saw kind of the statewide gross number. These are burned acres estimated by ownership class. And again, these are an approximate number. I would look at these as kind of the floor for the numbers that are going to come in once we've gone through everything with a fine tooth comb. But you look at that small private number, and that's, your small woodland community, private house and 5 acre type stuff. 120,000 acres were burned in that ownership class. Large private, typically thought of, landowners with more than 5,000 acres. We're up to about 240,000 acres. And then the state of Oregon took a significant impact. The Santiam State Forest alone took a huge hit, but looking at about 26,000 acres, ODF, ODOT, parks, ODFW lost some acres. Local government, when you start seeing local government losing 470 acres, that's like Doug said, that's an incredibly humbling number when you understand that typically local government is city limits, inside city limits where they own stuff. And so when you're burning that kind of acre, it's significant damage comes with a number like that. BLM 133,000, that's predominantly O&C lands. That's the productive acres on the west side that provide fiber to the mills. And so that's a huge number itself. The core, you're talking the acres around the dam. Obviously the Forest Service acres are significant, and then BIA and Lion's Head predominantly. And again, those are productive timbered acres that they rely on for substantial income for the tribe over there. So incredible impacts, incredible response. The story, it's going to last forever, at least in our lifetimes, and not something we've been able to see or tried to quantify. So I'll get out of the way. I want to say thanks to the folks from Justina, Jeremy Norby, and this fella here, Milt Moran, specifically for providing the pictures that you see and really personifying, again, what we mean when we talk about that public-private partnership in the fire system in Oregon. So, Seth, I'd kick it back to you. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists. We've got a number of questions here. So kind of maybe going back to a couple of questions for you, Doug. How long, so this kind of begs the question, how long do we have this Lloyd's of London policy, and is this, is it going to go into effect this year? And so questions there about the policy.
Yeah, we have a unique relationship with Lloyd's of London. It's one of a kind across the world for an insurance policy for catastrophic wildfire, and it pays for suppression costs only, not recoveries. It's a $25 million policy with a $50 million deductible. Over our 45 years of experience, we've paid $75 million in premiums over those 45 years and received $99 million in suppression costs. So it's favorable to the state of Oregon on our end. The premium currently sits at $4 million, and we're right at the edge of tipping the scales into that policy. I don't know that we'll reach that or not. There's a lot of FEMA recoveries. There's still some work to do. We're sitting, just under it. October 7th projection puts us at $48.1 million net costs after FEMA recoveries. So we're working with the insurance policy right now. Obviously, they have a keen interest. How will this impact our future with them? To be determined based on our negotiations this fall. But arguably, having a relationship with one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world has been a good thing for the state of Oregon. My hope is that we can continue a relationship in the future, but it's got to work for both parties.
All right. So getting back to, and maybe this is a question also for Doug, although Rick, you might have some insight here as well, and Kyle maybe also, but ignition sources, I know the investigations are ongoing. I would imagine that's part of the answer here, but we've got a couple of questions. Just wondering, do we know the ignition sources for these fires at this point, or what can you talk about there?
Yeah, we do not at this time. As you imagine, that's an important effort that needs to occur. It needs to happen under the right protocols and professional investigators, interagency, through joint task forces to establish the origin first and cause. Then we move the investigation to a responsible party and then liability. And the law requires us to do that for every fire stat on the landscape. A good portion of those are lightning, and a good portion, the large majority, are human caused. So we go through that effort on all these fires. You can imagine with the complexity of these and the number across the landscape, those investigations are ongoing. And that's all I can really report out on that today.
Understood. So a question for Rick related to as you were out there on these fire lines, you talked about trying to wrap your arms around this, and how do you even get started when you're facing a cloud of smoke like that, and the size of the fire that it was, even under what we typically call initial attack. Take us through that a little bit. How did you guys handle that from an on-the-ground perspective on the Archie fire?
Yeah, well, I think, the first day we were looking at, actually DFPA had 3 fires that first day, and one of them we got our arms around. It started shortly after midnight, was about 600 acres just outside of Glide, and we had that corralled. And at the same time, we had the Archie fire was burning, that originated on the Forest Service. And then about between those 2 fires was a third fire that started. And because we had that first fire corralled and we already had aircraft and equipment working on it, we immediately diverted a lot of resources to that third fire. And it was the conditions were such that we just could not catch it, even though we were literally right there. The conditions were so explosive. So then from there, you're focusing on trying to do what you can. The energies went to protecting the communities, and the fire was pushing towards the Glide and Sutherland and into Little River. So efforts went there. I personally, I couldn't really get in there till the third day safely, but the areas that had our clients' property at risk, and so we were doing recon, trying to figure out how we would attack it once the weather conditions and the equipment became available. So that planning was undergoing.
All right. And Doug, maybe a similar question for you. Across these fires, how does ODF, when you're in those initial, I can only imagine what that must have been like, and the number of phone calls and hit points that you're getting as the leader of this organization, in trying to wrap your arms around, and get a handle on suppression efforts. What did that look like in the first couple of days for you, and what were some lessons learned for you that might be helpful for us?
It didn't look like a lot of sleep, I'll tell you that. This event was something we've never experienced before relative to a response. And I mentioned the first 72 hours were life safety. So my focus was there. Unfortunately, through the first couple nights of this event. And attention did need to be paid there. So, a shout out to the military action that was taken. We were flying infrared helicopters to try to distract people who were caught between fires. We couldn't land those ships with the 50 to 60 mile an hour winds. So position those folks at the right place, monitored through, aerial support and the comms we had on the ground where we had it, and then cut our way through road systems to extract people that second day. So that first 48 hours, aligning resources both where we could take suppression action, because there were places where we could, and then focus in on life safety. And I would say the life safety part of that equation was not something I've spent a lot of effort in the past. I'm used to the suppression side of this equation. And so kind of tackling both of those through an enterprise response from the state, with state fire marshal, local fire protection districts, governor's office, to move the right resources where we need them, was new territory, but it was operated in a system we know well, which is incident command structures. And we are a partner in the Oregon Emergency Response System, so we train on a number of those fronts. But exercising it this way, I think we'll do a lot of after-action reviews, understanding, what critical emergency response looks like for the state. We typically train on subduction zone exercises, right? And that's what our background is relative to that level of response. On the suppression side of the business, at the local level, a grassroots effort, as you hear from my peers on the panelists. This system works because I don't have to be at the tip of the spear on all of that. We have empowered Oregonians and landowners to be a part of the system, and that's what makes it work. And we train together on the front end. So a little less pressure from me, frankly, on that. If it was just the suppression side of the equation, I think it would have been, to a degree, as I could even say this, business as usual relative to local decisions being made, and me supporting where I can from the top end. And that would be coordination internationally, ensuring we got the resources flowing in. So the first thing we certainly looked at was we had 3,000 firefighters on the ground from existing fires. Ensuring those lines held were critically important, and then deal with the new ones. And we knew we needed to up that into the 6,000 to 7,000 range relative to boots on the ground, and we did that in short order. And that's outreach into Canadians and across the state. So within that first 72 hours, we built up to about 7,500 at our peak, which is where we needed to be for this response.
So a question for Kyle. As the fires were kind of unfolding in the Lions Head, or sorry, the Beachy and Lions Head and Riverside, there was talk about those coming together, and I have to imagine there's a lot of private land between those two fires. And I remember thinking as that was being discussed on Portland radio, frankly, I remember thinking, wow, that's a lot of acres between those two fires if those are coming together. And it looks like they're not going to come together, and they didn't come together. Question for you, Kyle. How did that, those efforts with the landowners and coordinating with the fire teams, and can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can try, and Doug probably has some additional information he might throw in, but that's a good point, Seth. There's about, at the time we figured it was about 30,000 acres between Riverside and Beachy Creek that sort of had been assumed as inevitably lost. But nobody had told the landowners that were out there working on it. At least, they weren't listening, because they saw an opportunity, and they were fighting fire aggressively and safely in there. And as the days were starting to progress, it looked like they had a chance to make it work. And one thing I didn't take the time to talk about is the there are two kind of different fire organizations in the state, and that's ODF that we've been talking about most of this morning. And then, there's more of the interagency federal U.S. Forest Service, BLM. And the scale of the event we had was so large that there were several teams from outside of Oregon that were having to come and help. And in that example, there was what we call an out of region team. And when the team got on the ground, they were going to fight fire the way they were used to. That's put lines around the big outside of the fire and light her off and wait till it all comes together. But they weren't quite used to the engagement from the landowner community and getting direct and watching that happen. And so there was a couple-day period where there was really some feeling out, hey, this is what we're doing. We think we can stop it. It's going to happen. The landowner had the resources. They needed more help, but frankly, there wasn't much to go around. And ODF stepped into that gap and really clearly communicated with that federal team, this is how we do it in Oregon. If we can do it safely, we put line tight to that fire, and we save every inch of ground that we can. And like Doug said, the first 72 hours was, let's keep people safe. And the second those columns all sort of stood straight up, everybody pounced on it to try and tightline that stuff. And that section of ground between those two fires was a perfect example of that. And also that communication between the two worlds of fire. But they let them do it. And I think there was a lot of success stories statewide around sort of the federal normal culture of fighting fire adapting to the Oregon way. And there was some success in amongst the disaster.
One of the key components that really helped us was we had a daily cooperators meeting between the landowner representatives and the fire team. We had a fire team from the Southeast United States. And so we would meet every day, talk to them about what had been accomplished and kind of our plans moving forward for the next day. And that interaction with the landowners right there firsthand with the operations people from the fire team was a critical step.
Excellent. I think we have a few more minutes to answer a few of these questions. I think we're going to take a little bit of time from the break, so hopefully that folks are good with that. But I think we're going to get to a few of your questions here. First one comes from Edie Dooley. Are you replacing plastic culverts with plastic again? Or does this experience make folks think about using steel a little bit more like traditional? So maybe that's for Rick, Kyle, Doug. I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, Doug tells us this is a historic event, and I certainly believe him. So we are currently replacing plastic with plastic, and just pray that we don't have to do this again.
Yeah. And I've heard that question. In fact, it came up recently at OFIC, and similar answer. So I think that's pretty much an answer across the contingent there. So
one of the things that's a reality, though, is we may be putting in whatever we can obtain. I mean, culverts are in short supply. You want to buy a culvert today, you don't just go out and do it.
Yeah, good point. So sticking with some of the salvage piece, Rick, do you have any idea of the industry, if the industry has the capacity to handle all of the salvage burned timber coming in such a short period of time? What's your sense there?
My sense is that our industry is extremely creative, but I think the reality is the volume is so great that I think we're going to have to set our priorities and get the most we can. Leave the things that are kind of marginal salvage. If we'll be kissing some salvage goodbye, but if 70% of the stand's still there, maybe walking away from some of those just to save them for another day, recognizing the capacity issue.
Yeah, and Seth, I would add, Rick mentioned the example of 6 sides worth of equipment getting burnt up in Archie Creek, and that's not unique to Archie Creek. Holiday Farm lost a bunch of equipment, you name it. Again, Columbia to California. Not only the volume of black wood we've got to try and figure out what to do with. That's a significant portion of our operator capacity that we've got to figure out how to replace. And you can't go down to Ace and rent one of these things. So that's, like Rick said, the creativity of the industry. I think folks are already thinking about how do we help everybody get back on their feet and keep moving. But boy, the challenges are enormous.
Amen. And I would add the reforestation effort is going to be nothing short of Herculean as well. We've been at OFIC trying to coordinate with all of the various different landowners and talking about, what seedling, you mentioned it, Rick, how do we boost seedling supply? And then once you have the seedlings, do we have the crews to put those in the ground? What does that look like? And there's been a lot of conversation about shifting seedlings into different areas to try to, emphasize the burn area, because clearly you've got an erosion issue that's going to be a problem on a lot of these. So I was up on one of the fires just last week, and the soil is just toasted. It's just baked in a lot of these areas. In fact, from my perspective, and maybe this is helpful for folks on this in this meeting here, I've been on fires my whole career. I don't know that I've seen one that looked like it had quite that intensity as what I saw on Beachy. Going through a 10-year-old reprod stand, and there's not even any branches left on the young tree that's sticking up. All that's left is the bowl of that tree, and it's bent sideways like this from the wind, almost kind of frozen in time without any limbs to be seen. Pretty incredible. So that maybe gets to a question here for Doug. Energy release component. What's involved in it, and why the trend, and what can change it?
This is one of the standard ones, fire indices we use on a daily basis to look at risk on the landscape. It's a cumulative assessment of fuel conditions, both live and dead fuel moistures. That's an indication of the intensity of a fire front and its resistance to control. So when we know our ERCs by district are in the 90th percentile, based on our historic records, and we can look back, we got a high potential for large fire spread on that day. And if we know there's lightning threats or high winds, then we mobilize resources accordingly. So it's about fuel conditions. It's a measurement of the condition of those fuels. So what we can do about it is what we do as foresters every day is manage the landscapes, you know, and how do we mitigate the risk of those fuels catching fire. With the drought conditions and the atmospheric conditions and fuel conditions, you're not going to change the energy release component other than changing the condition and the volume of that fuel on the landscape, distribution of that fuel on the landscape, and that's all natural resource management.
It's a great, maybe a great point to end on, and something that all of us are involved in here as the Society of American Foresters, and trying to manage that side of this equation. So apologize, we weren't able to get to all of your questions. I think we did touch on the ones that are left here. I think we did touch on some of the component of some of those. And I want to thank you guys again. When this idea came up to put this panel together, my initial thought was this is the most relevant thing in the moment. But there's no way we're going to be able to bring these guys together because they've been so overworked over the last few weeks. And so I really appreciate all three of you being willing to take the time here. And we all appreciate the efforts that everyone took, from the agency to the private landowners, to help suppress these fires. And it's a great feeling to know that they're likely to be released back to the district soon. Our heart goes out to the communities that have lost so much across the state. It's incredible. And I'm sure as all of you out there on this call today, or in this meeting today, will get a chance to get around Oregon in the coming months, you'll see, if you haven't already, some of that devastation, and it's incredible. We're lucky to have this system, and lucky to have folks that are as engaged as you guys all are. So appreciate your time. And with that, Julia, I'll turn it back to you and Mike. Thank you again.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Doug, Rick, and Kyle. I think really informative. Also, I think we all know it's a big project ahead. And, I think this was a great kickoff on thinking of how SAF can keep bringing members together to have this conversation about how to be innovative and how we're going to work with the departments and, just everybody to help move this forward. And if those of you that haven't seen too, OSU Extension and NRCS and others also are putting together a webinar series. It's already started for after the fire, and ODS provided some really great resources and information there for landowners, especially our family forest landowners who are really struggling to know where to start. So a lot of great work of everyone involved trying to just help people to respond to this. And I really know we have the resources to think about recovery, and really, opportunity, I think, for all of us to work together to help us in the future.